It seemed like the end of the world. There was nowhere to run for Derek and his friends. They were completely surrounded by hungry, glowing eyes. They were closing in. They held each other, shaking, saying nothing. At last, they accepted the situation. The truth was that they could not escape. Maybe it had always been impossible. The red mist encircled them, almost close enough to touch. The eyes floated inside, incorporeal and without any real form, all except for one of them. The monster who moved above the rest. Its elongated head emerged from the swirling red fog, the tongue preceding it. Its hands reached out, open wide as if to embrace all of them at once. Derek looked up into its eyes, feeling all fear pass from him. He felt the others relax as well. They were all falling into a trance. Before he could fully fall, a voice he thought he would never hear again spoke. "Guys," Jason's voice called to them, as if out of a dream in the midst of a nightmare. Derek knew it couldn't really be his friend. Still, he began to turn his head to look for himself. He barely managed to blink away from the entrancing glow of the monster's eyes and turn. Behind them, he saw something impossible. Jason, the only thing visible was his torso, was waving and calling at them. "Derek," he said. "Jason," Derek said in an unbelieving daze. "Is that really you?" Jason's waving became more frantic. "Get the others," he said. Derek shook his head and gathered his senses. With all his will, he brushed off the lulling effects of the monster and thrust his friends back until they were near to Jason. Together, they herded them together. Derek looked at the place. Jason's body disappeared into thin air. He reached out his hand and gasped when his hand disappeared as he reached past him. His hand felt cool on the other side. "Don't just stand there," Jason said. "Help me." Behind them, the monster roared in anger as the friends were all pushed through the strange barrier. Derek then went through. Jason, at the last, stared defiantly at the monster. Its tongue writhed, agitated in the air. Then he too disappeared through the barrier, knowing with some satisfaction that they had made the beast angry and deprived it of its ill-gotten prize. Appearing back in the strange chamber, Jason saw his friends getting oriented. One by one, they noticed Jason's enigmatic companion. They instinctively recoiled away from him. Jason stepped in between him and the group. "Guys, don't be afraid. He is here to help," he said. "Who is he?" Kyle said. "Not gonna lie, dude. I don't think I can take another weirdo on this ride." Jason couldn't deny that the stranger was indeed a weirdo. "He saved my life when I was almost taken by one of the monsters," he said. "We can trust him." "You mean there is more than one of those things?" Amber said, looking pale. "More than you can ever imagine," the man said, making them all go silent. "They will find us here eventually. We need to leave this realm before more unwanted eyes find us. Time is running short." "Sounds good to me," Kyle said. Derek and Amber nodded, looking eager to leave. Sophie still looked unsure. Megan took a step towards the man and studied him for a moment. "Who are you?" she said. Jason remarked how this was the first time since this whole ordeal began that she didn't mention she was getting a bad feeling. Honestly, that made him feel a lot better about trusting the stranger. To everyone's surprise, the man reached out a gloved hand and pressed it to Megan's cheek. There seemed to be a sense of soft tenderness there, maybe even affection. Jason wondered if the man somehow knew her. Then again, he really could be anyone. He was taking precautions to hide his face. The man never answered Megan. Maybe he never meant to, but they would never have the chance to find out, because a tremor shook the room. There was a series of screeches that sounded afar off. They didn't think that it would stay that way if they remained where they were. "They have found us," the man said, taking his hand back. He raised it towards the symbol that was still on the wall. To their astonishment, the design of the symbol changed, rewriting itself until it became an entirely new design. Then it began to glow again. The screeching was getting closer, and now it was coming from all directions. They looked around with nervous glances, expecting things to come out of the shadows at any moment. Derek turned to the man. "Wait, another one of our friends came in here with us. His name is Ryan. Can't we save him too?" The man turned towards him. He gave a reluctant shake of his head. "I was too late to save your friend. I am sorry," he said. Derek hung his head, his hands going into fists. He was shaking, but not from fear. It was sadness and anger. Tears formed in his eyes. Amber came next to him and put a hand on his shoulder. He looked up, his eyes full of deep hurt. "I'm sorry," she said. She didn't need to say any more, and he nodded in gratitude. "Go now," the man said in a warning voice. "They are almost here." Sure enough, the shadows at the ends of the passages were alive with movement. Unimaginable shapes were pressing forward. They were moving at an alarming speed, and their terrible cries were hungry. They all gathered before the glowing symbol. Then, one by one, they all turned back. They noticed that the man stayed behind. "You're not coming," Megan said, concern in her voice. "You all will see me again," the man said. "For now, go back to your world. Do not worry. I am not in danger. Now, go." His last two words were commanding, and the group felt compelled to follow his instructions. They all stepped up to the very edge of the wall, then they held hands. Each one of them glanced back one last time. The man was still there, and the shadows seemed to be closing in around him. Then, as one, they stepped into the glow of the symbol, passing through the once solid object. Jason, as he looked back until the last possible moment, thought he saw the man begin to shine as the shadows lunged at him. Then everything went a blinding white. As the children were finally escaping the realm of the moving house, Julio, Stacy, Alicia, and Heather were still in the Tolman house. They were deeply conflicted. "What do you mean you left the book in the room?" Heather said, annoyed. "It doesn't matter," Stacy said. "We need to get out of here." "No, it might help us," Julio said. "Don't you see?" Alicia said. "It's told us all we needed. We need to leave." "And go where?" Julio said. As he said this, they heard something move behind them. They all whirled around, the book all of a sudden completely forgotten. As they listened, they heard the sound again. It was a whining drone, like a melancholy motor trying desperately to stay alive. Julio got in front of the women, drawing his gun up. He moved down the hallway. The women followed so close that Stacy actually clipped his heel once and almost went sprawling. Julio waved them back as he reached the end of the hallway. In the sitting room, where they had last seen Tolman, the engine continued to whir. He checked the corner and swept his eyes around the room. He yelled and stumbled back, his legs losing their strength. He landed in a pile, his hands going to his face. "Oh my God," he said, appalled. "What?" Stacy said. "What is it?" Heather went to go look, but Julio stopped her by grabbing her sleeve. "Don't," he said. "You don't want to see that." Alicia didn't listen and pushed past them. She burst into the room. She just couldn't hold back her curiosity. The other women followed her. Stacy was trying to stop her while Heather was joining her. They had no words for what they saw. Tolman's body was nailed to the wall in the style of the crucifixion. He had been stripped naked, and his flesh was mutilated, exposing his insides in a grotesque display. His entrails hung down from his body, lying in a pile at his feet. Rivulets of blood streamed down the wall and into a pool onto the floor. At the center of his body, his manhood had been removed and was placed in the open cavity where the heart used to be. At eye level, the heart was pierced into the wall. The engine sound they were hearing was Tolman's wheelchair. It was on its side, the wheels spinning. Smoke was coming from the motor, and judging from the blood on the seat and the smoke idling upwards, it was easy to tell why the engine was struggling. It was flooding with blood. Alicia broke first, running outside. There, she began to puke her guts out on the driveway. Heather followed soon after. Stacy, however, stayed as something caught her eye. Julio gathered himself off the floor. He tugged at her arm, but stopped when she pointed. "Do you see that?" she said. He looked, and after a moment of scrutiny, he did indeed see what she was seeing. The rivulets coming down from the body were not random by any means. They formed, in the most rudimentary way, ordered lines and geometrical shapes. Altogether, the gore made an insane symbol. "Let's get out of here," Julio said. "This place is cursed." Stacy allowed herself to be led from the house. They found Alicia and Heather sitting on the lawn, their arms wrapped around their legs, shaking. For a long moment, no one knew what to say. "What do we do now?" Heather said at last. "We don't know where to look for our kids. We don't know who to trust, and we don't know where that psycho is." A voice answered from out of nowhere. "Your children are safe, and I have dealt with the parasite." They all whirled around, Julio with his gun pointing. There, in the drive where no one was before, a man stood. He wore a normal jacket, jeans and shirt, yet his face was covered by a strange, featureless mask, and he had dark gloves on. "Identify yourself," Julio said, more than a little frantic. The man raised his hands. "I am only here to help," he said. "The children are now free of the moving house." "Where are they?" Stacy said, a little madness in her voice. "Please, tell us." "I will show you," the man said. Something happened to all of them that they could not fully explain. It was similar to the way the journal had showed them the events leading to the brothers' downfall and the birth of the pact. They were now in the woods, and before them, their children were sleeping on the forest floor. The women screamed with relief and went to touch their children, but they couldn't move. The man appeared in the midst of the kids. "Go to them," he said. "I will come back when affairs are in order." The vision dissipated, and they all found themselves back in front of the Tolman house. Yet in their minds, the location was firmly set, and somehow they knew exactly where to go. They also noticed the mysterious man was nowhere to be seen. "Where did he go?" Julio said. The women barely paid him any mind. They each jumped into their cars and were speeding off before he even got his own started. The children woke up to a beautiful sound, one they now knew they had taken for granted all their lives. The woods were alive around them, and soon they were whooping with joy and relief. Derek, however, was the first to become somber as he remembered that Ryan was not there with them to celebrate life and freedom. He was dead. No, worse, he was something else now, still in that hell. The friends gathered together, comforting each other. They cried, screamed, and even had fits of rage where they hit each other or themselves. They existed in their pent-up emotions for a long time. Eventually, they had no more to give. They simply hung on to one another, breathing in the fact that they were alive and safe. Then, a crash in the woods made their nerves jump to full alert. There was more crashing. Their muscles tensed as they prepared to run from whatever it was. Their minds whirled, terrified. Was it the moving house? Did one of its monsters somehow cross over and was now coming after them? That's when they heard their names being called. They all looked at each other, frightened. They had already been tricked once. They were determined not to follow the voices, even though they wanted to with all their hearts. Jason heard his mom calling for him, the same with Amber. Yet Derek's, Sophie's, Megan's, and Kyle's faces remained pale. Among those voices was a voice that they knew well. It was Alicia Turner, Ryan's mom. The women burst into the grove. There were the children, staring up at them as if waiting. They looked tired, ragged, and completely terrified. But they were alive. Jason almost didn't want to believe his mother was right in front of him. He was afraid that it would be some cruel trick again. Amber couldn't look her mother in the eyes because she was afraid Heather would morph into a monster. Yet, when the mothers gathered their beloved children into their arms, they could not help themselves from falling into tears, returning the embraces with all the strength they could muster. Alicia stood back, scanning the group. Her hand went to her mouth. Derek could not look her in the eyes, and the others were avoiding her gaze as well. She stumbled forward, a pit forming in her stomach. A dread, unlike any she had ever known, was welling up inside her. A terrible truth was surfacing in her mind. "Ryan," she said as if dazed. Everyone stopped and looked from her to the group of youth. No one said anything. "Where is my son?" Derek, shaking, finally looked up. Tears were in his eyes again. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. He tried to say more, but his voice choked up, and suddenly he started to wail in despair. He fell to his knees, weeping. "It's all my fault," he said, over and over again. Alicia only stared, realization dawning on her. She already knew. Somewhere deep down, she believed the picture in the journal, the one that showed her son being eaten by the monster. She also fell to her knees, and for a moment, her and the weeping boy stared at each other. For a moment, Derek was sure that Ryan's mom was going to hit him. She was going to yell, angry, telling him that it really was all his fault. Alicia reached for him, her fingers looking like claws. The strike did not come. Instead, she embraced him, squeezing him hard. Then, when she started to cry, it got him going again. For a long time, there was not one among them that did not shed tears.